Our program today is I think, of particular interest, and we are very pleased that Mike is going to give this program. My first memory of Mike was, I think, shortly after he moved here, and he came into this society and was asking questions about the house on Utica Street that he was living in. And I don't know if I was here alone or if maybe John or Dick were here, I don't know, but what he was telling about the house was more information than I knew about it anyway. So I knew that this was someone that we would want to have involved in the Historical Society. And the Historical Society certainly jumped on that, because now not only is he a member of the board, he is also an integral part of our newsletter, and he also is playing a big part in the Old Burying Ground project that we are involved in right now. But one of his keen interests has been in the Universalist Church, because the house that he lives in was a church building in the past. And today he's going to talk to us about the women in the Universalist Church. And from the looks of the audience, the women in Clinton are quite interested in the women of the Universalist Church. And so with no further ado, Mike Revenaugh.
Oh, there we go. Is that all right? How's the volume for everyone? Can you hear me?
Good.
All right, great. I don't have to stress myself too much. So thank you for coming to my talk. Welcome also to the joint Clinton-New Hartford Historical Society talk. Where are my New Hartford people at? Okay, we're represented. All right, good. Yes, as Rose mentioned, I moved to Clinton in 2019 and into a house on 8 Utica Street, which we will be seeing in our slideshow momentarily, and got interested in the Universalist Church. I'm going to be talking about 5 specific women of the Universalist Church in Clinton, and more accurately, of and pertaining to the Universalist Church and its side ventures in Clinton, because not all of them were Universalists and not all of them were members of the church. So without further ado, our story will begin where so many stories do, in New Hartford. So in 1805, Reverend Nathaniel Stacy, who was a traveling preacher of the Universalists, founded the Universalist Society of New Hartford, and they also founded the first church. I've heard it alternately, the first church in New York State, the first church in New York State outside of New York City, and the first Universalist church, no, all of those are Universalist churches, and the first Universalist church west of the Hudson. So the Universalist Society of New Hartford was very much the inroads to the rest of the state early in the 19th century. As an offshoot of the New Hartford Church, this guy, Brother Stephen Rensselaer Smith, was pastor of the Universalist Church in New Hartford, and then noticed that a significant percentage of his congregation was from Clinton, and they realized that they should start their own society in Clinton. So in 1821, he came over and built the old brick church at 8 Utica Street. And this is the earliest representation of it that I can find. This is a clipping from the Clinton Courier's centennial issue, celebrating the centennial of Clinton. There is one photograph that I could find of the building. It is actually in the foyer of this building. Is this? Okay. Anyway, is a view of the church and the landscape of Clinton from the knob, the big hill over here behind Mulberry. And you can just see the back corner of it, because it does not look like this anymore. It looks like this right now. Or it looks like this last October, anyway, when this picture was taken. So it was built as a free church, because it was the first church building in Clinton. And it was a free church for the first several years. The Methodists and the Baptists used it, as well as the Universalist congregation. And until they then moved out and built their own churches, including this one. So the Universalists identified Clinton as a fertile ground for their church and for their projects. They wanted to start their own school, and with Hamilton College up the hill and a number of other churches and educational organizations already in town, in 1831 they opened the Clinton Liberal Institute. And this was a massive building located at the corner of Mulberry and Utica Streets. It was 4 stories tall with a basement. It also had, from the very beginning, a women's institute, a women's department that was originally located at the house that is now 14 Utica Street. It was a lovely white and blue building. Here's a photograph of the building. If you want to get a sense of how big it was, you can visit part of it right now. You can go up the hill to Hamilton College and look at the Carnegie dormitory, which was built out of the stones of this building once it was disassembled. They took them and carried it right up the hill and did another one. So again, it was not quite co-educational, but had men and ladies departments. In 1851, the White Seminary was completed up on Chestnut Street, and that was the expanded women's division of the Clinton Liberal Institute. This map of the town, or the village, from 1874 shows a period when all of the buildings that we'll be talking about were extant at the same time. We have the Clinton Liberal Institute male department here on Utica and Mulberry, the female department on Chestnut Street, 8 Utica Street right around there, 14 Utica Street right there-ish. And also the second Universalist Church building that was constructed in 1870, which you may be more familiar with as the Old Masonic Hall. So the Clinton Liberal Institute and the Universalists thrived in Clinton until 1878, when the Clinton Liberal Institute, faced with declining enrollment, as well as competing for funds with a number of other Universalist educational institutions, including Tufts College and St. Lawrence University, relocated to Fort Plain, New York. So the Clinton Liberal Institute was no longer of Clinton, and they went to in 1878, went to Fort Plain, operated for another 22 years, and then burned out. Unfortunately, taking a lot of records with it. So some of the surviving records of the Institute are held at St. Lawrence University Library, which I'm eager to get my hands on one of these days. But without the Liberal Institute pinning down the congregation as a source of pride, unfortunately, the Universalist congregation in Clinton fizzled out over the next couple of decades, and they no longer have a significant presence. The previous hall got sold to the Masons. Their old church was used as a warehouse for several decades, and then converted to a residence in 1825. So the first, I was trying to think of how to best present the women that I want to talk about, and I will start with one who should be more famous than she is, and also has the least involvement with the Universalist Church that I can identify. So she is technically of the Universalist Church because she was a student at the Clinton Liberal Institute, and that is Matilda Joslyn Gage. She was born in Cicero, New York. Her father was a physician and a prominent abolitionist. Matilda grew up in a house that was a stop on the Underground Railroad, so she had abolition fused into her being by her upbringing. Her father also gave her a very advanced private education, and her hope, as well as his hope, was that she'd become a physician. And he tried to pull some strings together into medical school, and it did not work out because she was a woman. And she attended Clinton Liberal Institute briefly. I do not know exactly what years, but she left when she was 18 and became engaged to her then husband, Henry Gage. She was not present at the Seneca Falls Convention, despite being a force in the suffragist movement. Her excuse was that she had given birth the day before, so it was probably a good one. She became prominently involved in the women's rights movement in 1852 when she spoke at the National Women's Rights Convention in Syracuse, New York, to great acclaim. Her speech from that was actually published afterwards. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who were there, took note of her, and they became known as the triumvirate of the suffragist movement. If you're like, I didn't know that, I didn't know her, I haven't heard of this woman, there is a good reason for that. Well, not a good reason, but a reason, and I'll get around to it. She served as the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association from 1875 to 1876. She wrote The History of Women's Suffrage and the Declaration of Rights of Women, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and, to a lesser extent, Susan B. Anthony. She was a firebrand. She was a no-nonsense woman who was for rights across the board. She was a suffragist, abolitionist. When she and Henry opened their house in Fayetteville, she promptly put that as a stop on the Underground Railroad as well. She was an advocate for indigenous rights, going so long as to be adopted into the Mohawk tribe. She was arrested for registering to vote. She campaigned heavily during Susan B. Anthony's trial when she was arrested for attempting to vote. She signed a petition refusing to obey the Fugitive Slave Act. And what made that more impressive is this was a petition that was passed around the congregation where she was attending, and she was one of 2 people to sign it, so it wasn't like, they can't get all of us. It's like, they know who you are. She was willing to do the difficult things. In 1876, she wrote to her son, "I want you to bring my revolver and cartridges, have them serviced." She was expecting trouble because she had scheduled an organization meeting on Sunday, and she was fearful of religious conservatives who at that time were pressing for Sunday to be a state-mandated day of rest. So she was expecting trouble and wanted to be ready for it. So, son, bring me my gun, make sure it's loaded, and make sure it works. Thankfully, she did not have to use it at that day, and everything went off peacefully. A story of how some of her beliefs kind of worked against her. One day, her daughter Maud brought home an actor named Lyman that she wanted to marry, and her mother took one look at this guy and looked at his employment history and how he kind of bounced around from place to place, acting, sometimes writing plays, and she said, absolutely not, you're not marrying this man. And her daughter says, well, thank you very much for your input, but you raised me as an individual to make my own decisions, so I'm marrying you. And she said, fine, that works. And she actually lived with Maud and her husband Lyman for several years before her death, and then Lyman did eventually get his act together and publish a book that some of you may have heard of. One that was revised by Lyman Frank Barton. Scholars who are more in depth of this than I have been trying to piece apart Matilda Gage's influence on her son-in-law, and they think that they can see it in some of the power structures of the Land of Oz. It's a very, very egalitarian feminist telling, especially of the time. The theory that I ascribe to is that the closest parallels in the writing is that the character of Uncle Henry and his relationship to his wife Aunt M were based on Henry Gage and Matilda Gage. Uncle Henry was a very retiring man who would defer to his stronger wife. The reason that you may not have heard of Matilda Joslyn Gage is because she had a falling out with Susan B. Anthony. She tried desperately hard to prevent the conservative drift of the suffragist movement. She wrote an 1893 book called Woman, Church, and State, where she outlined her beliefs that suffrage should not be tied to religious belief because organized religion was a driver of misogyny, and the Christian church as a whole set up that women were naturally inferior to men. So once Susan B. Anthony was trying to pick up religious conservatives who saw suffrage as a way towards temperance and to instill some Christian priorities in the government, Matilda Joslyn Gage said, absolutely not. They merged the American Women's Suffrage Association with the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was more conservative, and Stanton and Gage were like, no thank you. Matilda Joslyn Gage formed her own Women's National Liberal Union in 1890 and was president of that until her death. Of the three of the triumvirate, Matilda Joslyn Gage passed away first, Elizabeth Cady Stanton passed away second, and Susan B. Anthony was left to tell the story. And her biography was a work of revisionist history which very much downplayed the contributions of Matilda Joslyn Gage, which is probably why she does not have the place in history that she richly deserves. On her memorial stone, she was cremated, it's inscribed, "There is a word sweeter than mother, home, or heaven, and that word is liberty." So the next woman I want to talk about is also an alumni of the Clinton Liberal Institute, and one you may have heard of, I bet, Clara Barton. She studied for 1 year in 1851, best known nationwide as a frontline nurse during the Civil War. After the war, she ran the Office of Missing Soldiers, helping to locate and identify more than 22,000 missing men. She identified and buried 13,000 individuals who died just in the Andersonville prison camp. And she was the founder and president of the American Red Cross. In 1851, she enrolled in the Clinton Liberal Institute. And this is a neat picture that we found, and if you look very closely, you can see women on the front steps in their hoop skirts at their academic pursuits. She actually got to Clinton several weeks before the building was finished, so she boarded in town until the institute was ready to take the students in, and I wish I could say that she had a wonderful time and enjoyed like the best salad days of her girlhood at the Clinton Liberal Institute, but unfortunately that was not the case. She was 30 years old at the time that she enrolled, and that put her about a dozen years older than the rest of her classmates. So she felt a little separated from them socially. She had also already worked for about 10 years as a school mistress herself, so she had teaching experience, and she did not want to get a reputation as that old school marm who's studying with us, so she was a little bit reserved. One fun story about her is that to save money, she had 2 dresses made out of 1 bolt of fabric, which kind of led her to be known as that older lady in the green dress, no matter what she was. She eventually got over her homesickness and had a better time. She would go riding with a professor up the hill at Hamilton. But a couple of things during her tenure kind of soured her experience. One, unfortunately, her mother passed away when she was a student here. She was not able to get home for the funeral as the burial was completed by the time she learned about it. And the other, there was some stress on her family because her brother was indicted for bank robbery that year as well. He was later acquitted, but probably more due to his social standing than any lack of guilt. But she definitely was of the Universalist faith. She said towards the end of her life that she considered herself a Universalist all of her life. She was raised in a Universalist household, and found great value in the education that she received, particularly the principal of the female institution that helped her invent some of the rules so she could take a lot more classes than was primarily allowed for the ladies at that time. Moving on to Caroline Sawyer. She is the woman that I'm going to speak of today that spent the most amount of time in Clinton physically. She lived here for about 11 years all told in 2 different stretches. Caroline Matilda Fisher was born in Newton, Massachusetts, December 10, 1812. And she was the wife of Thomas Jefferson Sawyer, this guy. He was the minister of the Universalist Church from 1845 to 1852. During those years, he was also the principal of the Clinton Liberal Institute. Caroline herself, oops, there we go. I'm sorry, these are out of order. There we go. That's her at age 27. She was a prolific writer. So she contributed to Graham's Magazine, Knickerbocker Magazine, Democratic Review, Oddfellows Magazine, Horace Greeley's New Yorker. She was the editor of the annual Rose of Sharon from 1848 to 1858. This was all while assisting her husband on his 20-acre farm in Clinton as well. So she was one of those people that writing just flowed from her, like constantly writing. In a biography of her and her husband, they listed some of the poems that she had written, and they said, we would like to list them all, but it would encompass a volume about 6 times the size of this tome. And that book was about 500 pages. So throughout her life, she was just constantly putting out works. She published poetry, prose, philosophy, and also translated works from French and German. She's the mother of 6, 3 of whom survived to adulthood, actually 4 of whom survived to adulthood. And she also, when they were living in New York City, they became close friends with Horace Greeley, the famed publisher, and she would help him brainstorm ideas around the supper table when he came to visit them. And they actually helped him found the Tribune, the New York Tribune. The name was determined at Sawyer's dinner table when he was there, and once they got the very first printing of the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley ran over to the Sawyer household and showed it to Caroline Sawyer for her editing and approval. I do not know exactly where they lived in Clinton, and I'm going to find out, because I have these clues. For a short time after going to Clinton, the family boarded, but then in 1846 they purchased a small farm of 20 acres situated on the street leading from the village to Hamilton College, so on College Street. The house on the place was enlarged and improved and made into a roomy and comfortable 2-story dwelling, 48 by 24 feet, with an L 1 story in height, 24 by 22 feet. If this sounds like your house, let me know. This was their home until their return to New York. An additional purchase of adjoining land enlarged the farm to 42 acres, the Chenango Canal passing through it. So on that 1874 map earlier, the corner where now stands the Clinton tractor has the initials TJS, so that may have been part of the land that belonged to the Sawyer family. One of my favorite stories about Caroline Sawyer was that in 1870, on the close of the old Universalist brick church and moving the congregation to the new Universalist brick church, they invited a lot of people who, like old ministers, and Caroline submitted a hymn. I don't believe she was able to be there in person, but she rewrote a hymn to make it appropriate to the occasion and submitted it, and devoted an entire verse to like how this old brick church was so good to us, but it's a shame that everyone who had worked on it was long dead. Like I have it here. They who its foundations laid, long since into dust decayed. They who shaped its architrave, rest from labor in the grave. They who trod its aisles first, priest and people, they are dust. What she did not know was 2 people who helped build the church were at that ceremony. And it would be news to them that everyone who worked on this church was long since dead. The Sawyers later returned to Clinton in 1861, and Thomas Jefferson Sawyer took over the ministry of the church again until 1865, when they moved away. Their marriage was to last 62 years, and she died in 1892. The next woman that I have to speak about is another heavily involved in the Universalist Church, Caroline Augusta Sewell. Caroline Augusta White was born in 1824 in Albany, New York, and her journey through Clinton is my favorite story of all of them, because I'm a hopeless romantic. She was a principal of the female division of the Clinton Liberal Institute in 1841, and doing the math on that, yes, she was 17 at the time. So she was the principal, she was 17, and they did not pay her. So like, you there, teenage girl, we want to put you in charge of a group of other teenage girls. We will not pay you. And actually, some of the other students asked her requested that she wear a cap in order to appear more matronly. So like, we just tell you apart, like, which one of you is supposed to be in charge. So she got there, and they were saying, hey, we should introduce you to the principal of the male department, who is also the minister of the church right now. And she's like, great, okay. Like, I'm 17, I'm in over my head, I don't know what I'm doing. Now I have to like work with this crusty old academic. And then she met this smoke show. This hottie, this chin-strapped Adonis. Named Henry Birdsall Sewell. So I guess you can see where this is going. They worked closely together. In Caroline's own words, mutual pursuits at Clinton necessarily drew us together. Mutual trials begat sympathy, and who does not know that sympathy is the dawn of love? Ere the first term of our engagement closed, our hearts were one. So Caroline worked as the principal of the female department for 7 months, and then she left that position when she got married. They bounced around a little bit. Henry was the pastor of the Universalist Church in Utica for 1 year, and then they continued to work very well together. They had 5 children in the following 8 years, and unfortunately, at that point, Henry contracted smallpox in 1852, and 9 years after they were married, he died. She was left a young widow with 5 children, and she taught school to try and support herself, but her chief financial support was her writing. She was also a prolific writer, much like the other Caroline we just spoke about. She published stories in the Rose of Sharon and Elliott's Repository. She moved to Iowa briefly to try and cut down on her living expenses. She published a novel, Little Alice, or Pet of the Settlement, based on her experience living in the prairies. Wine or Water followed that up. It was a tale of New England, a temperance story. She remarried in 1855. In 1861, she became the assistant editor of the Ladies' Repository, reporting to the then editor, Caroline Sawyer. So all of our threads are coming together. Not content to simply support herself with her writing, she also helped found the Women's Centenary Aid Organization in 1869 and was its first president. The Women's Centenary Association then followed that as a permanent organization permanent charitable organization, and she was the first president of that when it was founded as well. And in 1879, at the age of 49, she decided, I might want to try preaching a sermon myself. So she did. And then, prior to that, in 1877, she became the Universalist Church's first missionary. They sent her overseas to convert the wild savages of, let me check my notes, Scotland. And she was very successful. She helped form the Scottish Universalist Convention and began preaching over there. And in 1880, Caroline Sewell was ordained by the Scottish Universalist Convention, making her the first woman to be ordained in the United Kingdom. By extension, possibly Europe as well. The Church of England would also ordain women a short 114 years later, in 1994. In 1899, Caroline Sewell was listed in the Who's Who in America because of her good works, and that was particularly entertaining to me because she was living in Glasgow at the time. So when she was in the Who's Who in America, she was not in America. She continued to live in Scotland, where she continued preaching until she passed away in 1903. So sad that her romance was cut so short, but she had a very full and impressive life following that. And the last person that I have to speak to you about today is Reverend Mrs. Lydia Ann Jenkins. And this is someone I like. If Matilda Joslyn Gage was erased from history, Mrs. Lydia Ann Jenkins has fallen through the cracks of it almost entirely. In fact, I do not have a picture of her. No one does. I'm in contact with the Reverend Barbara Koyman, who is publishing a biography of Lydia Ann Jenkins, and she asked me if I had a picture of her, because she can't find one either. But Lydia Ann Jenkins was raised in a Baptist family in Western New York. It's possible she attended the Seneca Falls Convention, and her house at the time was only a couple miles away. We do not have her signature on the Declaration of Sentiments. We do not know for a fact that she attended. We do know for a fact that she attended the convention in Syracuse in 1852, which might sound familiar because that's exactly where Matilda Joslyn Gage got her start as well. She was not on the docket of speakers, but she is recorded as having asked, "Is there any law to prevent women from voting in this state? The Constitution says white male citizens may vote, but it does not say that white female citizens may not." It was not a great argument. It's the argument that I believe let that golden retriever play basketball in the movie Air Bud, but she was very convicted. She was very enthusiastic and was vice president of the Albany Association and was heavily involved in the suffragist movement. Was on a number of boards, secretary positions, a number of committees, worked with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, worked with Susan B. Anthony, I'm sure worked with Matilda Joslyn Gage. Those records are forthcoming and don't know in exactly what capacity. However, in 1860, a short item appeared in the Christian Ambassador reporting that the Ontario Association had given the right of ordination to Brother E.S. Jenkins and Sister Lydia Jenkins, Brother E.S. Jenkins being her husband, Edmund. No amplification or substantiation of the statement has been found, and the association's meetings are missing. What is significant about this is, if it can be confirmed, this is the first ordination of a woman in the United States by a nationwide body. That distinction is more generally given to Olympia Brown, who was a Universalist, who was ordained 3 years later. So, Lydia Ann Jenkins and her husband were ordained at the same time. They then were assigned to be co-ministers of the Clinton of the Clinton Universalist Church and the Clinton Liberal Institute. So from 1860 to 1861, they were ministers at the Old Great Church. They also, she to the Female Institute, he to the Male Department, supported those organizations. What I like, one funny thing that I found is a quote from a contemporaneous source saying, "I suspect that Mrs. Jenkins has a millstone to carry in the person of her husband." And if only he would not call himself a clergyman, but go to boot blackening or some honorable occupation, all would be well. As a man, I judge he is clever, but as a preacher, he is so much inferior that the contrast will always be a hindrance to their combined success. She must itinerate, doubtless. And itinerate she did. While she was the co-minister of the Clinton Universalist Church, she was also preaching at least 3 other churches in the area, traveling around. She was very highly in demand for speaking engagements, to the extent that a lot of people, or on at least 3 occasions, people would put her on the bill without asking if she could make it, which she took as being very injurious to her reputation, and would publish broadsides saying, "Hey, I was being polite when I said that sounded like a neat idea 6 months ago. I never said I would actually be there, guys." She cut her teeth in public speaking on the suffragist circuit. She had a very forceful, was very highly esteemed as a minister across the board. Unfortunately, very few records of what she actually said, what she actually looked like, survived. And part of that is because she was the first ordained female minister, but she also did not stay that way to the rest of her life. In 1863, she and Edmund left the ministry. They did not leave the Universalist Church, but they stopped preaching, and they went to and attended the Hydropathic and Hygienic Institute in New York, and then moved to Binghamton to start a hydrotherapy clinic. So they opened a hydrotherapy clinic in Binghamton in 1865, where she lived, and had on her headstone, she is Reverend Lydia Ann Jenkins, M.D., and she was a proponent of hydrotherapy, hygiene, vegetarianism, and she lived in Binghamton and worked until her business and home burned down in 1874, and she passed several weeks later due to injuries sustained in that. So I believe the lack of records from the ordaining council, the fact that she did not have a long and illustrious career as a minister, as Reverend Sewell did, and the fact that she passed away relatively early in her life, all contributed to her contributions being vastly under-recognized. And that is my presentation on women of the Universalist Church, and I will open it up to questions. Yes?
Can you tell us a little bit about the Universalist Church and what their beliefs were?
Sure. The Universalist Church, their most distinct and what they're named after is the doctrine of universal salvation. So they were a church that believed that all people will go to heaven. They differ in how that process works. There was actually a convention that was held in Clinton that it was a large skew in the congregation, because there was one side of the aisle that said the earth is punishment enough. Like the fact that we all suffered and went and lived in this sphere is the trial, is the punishment. So upon death, everyone is instantly reunited with the Lord and ascend to heaven. And the other side was like, but what about murderers, guys? So the other side was like, yes, everyone does get to heaven. There may be a period of correction involved. Regardless, these beliefs did not sit very well with some of the other prominent religious sects at the time, the Methodists and Baptists. They were a common target for people slinging stones. There were several lawsuits coming up trying to invalidate testimony based on the fact that people were Universalists and did not believe in eternal damnation. Therefore, them swearing under oath should not be enforceable because their oath doesn't mean anything. Those were thrown out of court, thankfully. But several of the speakers, or several of the ministers that I spoke of, especially Reverend Stephen Rensselaer Smith, were game for a fight. So they would answer any broadside against the Universalist Church with challenges for debate, scriptural merits of universal salvation, and they would give a lot better than they got. And it's kind of neat going back through some of the old newspapers and seeing tent revivals popping up in the city where they're like, because there were so many churches and just constantly jockeying for the limited resources, and people like jumping from congregation to congregation and be like, oh, we had a tent revival and we're so much more holy than those Universalists that we got 5 people to come from the Universalists and join our church. And then the Universalists were like, well, we didn't want them anyway. And it's like, show up Saturday night and I will debate you. And then it would go back and forth. And it's like, it's been 2 weeks, I still haven't gotten an answer to my debate. So it was all in good fun. But that was the very much the defining belief system of the Universalist Church. They were also fairly socially liberal, as you could see from the early ordination of women, and many of the members were pretty stridently abolitionist. Yes, sir?
I'm sorry, the house on Chestnut Street with the pillars, I don't know, is that related to the Liberal Institute building or the salvage from
It is on the site of the Institute building, and the pillars are the same. The rest of it has been rebuilt.
You had shown a picture of the Joslyn Gates tombstone. Where is she buried?
Fayetteville.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she was buried in her homestead in Fayetteville, New York. She also operates as a museum, which I'm going to go to very soon.
Was it still called the Clinton Liberal Institute when it was in Fort Wayne?
It was, yes. So they actually have a historic marker on the campus of where the building stood, and it says Clinton Liberal Institute, and I'm mad about that. It's like, I think we should get a better marker. Say the real Clinton Liberal Institute. The primary Clinton Liberal Institute.
You wanted to relate to the name Sawyer. I remember when I was in 3rd grade, my teacher, who seemed old to me then, was a Miss Sawyer. She lived on Hamilton, Beatrice Sawyer. She lived on Hamilton Place in Clinton. Don't know where they're from.
Yeah, I know, I'm not sure how long the family stuck around, because the Thomas Jefferson Sawyer and Caroline Sawyer moved to New Jersey in 1865 and then retired to Tufts University following that. Their son, Thomas Jefferson Sawyer Jr., maintained the farm for at least several years after that, and I have lost track of that branch of the family tree. I'm not sure if he then moved away and took his family with him, or if they still had descendants in the area.
I was just curious about, like, with all the genealogy efforts now and ancestry, would there be ways to, pursue some of those?
I'm sure there are, and I'm going to get into some of them. Yeah. Unfortunately, Lydia Ann Jenkins had one daughter before she passed away, so I'm not sure. It's difficult to track her. The Sawyers were more prominent, so I believe that some branches of their family will still be extant, along with the Sewells as well. They have 5 children who all survived to adulthood, and a 6th with her second husband. Yeah, Mary?
Did any of these women have involvement in the Civil War? I know that did the church have, were they anti-war like the?
They were, opinions varied, so I hesitate to paint with a very broad brush, but at least Matilda, Joslyn, Gage, Carolyn Sawyer, and Lydia Ann Jenkins were all staunch abolitionists. And as far as direct engagement with the war effort, I believe they did more volunteer work around the area. They did not travel, certainly not to the extent that Clara Barton did. But Caroline Sewell, for much of the Civil War, was just trying to get by. So she founded some aid organizations to try to get resources to veterans.
Oh, good.
But as far as active support during the war is keeping the fires on the home front.